The air in Highland Park was thick with sweat and gasoline, and the scent of the last remnants of spring melting into summer. Walt Kowalski stood on his porch, a cigarette clenched between his yellowed fingers, the smoke curling lazily into the dusk. He watched as Thao Vang Lor crossed the street, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the sidewalk like he didn't belong to it. It was a walk Walt had seen 100 times, certain soft-footed, not like the others. Not like Spider or the rest of that damned gang of punks that prowled the neighborhood like they owned it. But something had changed in the last week. Something in Thao's posture, in the way he glanced over his shoulder more often, like he was tracking shadows behind him. Walt noticed everything these days. It was how he'd survived a war, and a wife, and 60 years of disillusionment. He noticed when people got quiet or louder than they should be. He noticed when they stopped asking for help. Thao hadn't shown up to help him with the gutter like he promised, nor had he come around to talk about college applications or jobs. Instead, Walt had seen him once, standing beside Spider outside the liquor store, hoodie drawn up, eyes hidden, pretending not to see him as he walked past, pretending like he didn't know the man who had once taught him how to hold a hammer, who had stood on this very porch and yelled at gangbangers to get the hell off his lawn. That boy was disappearing, and something else was growing in his place. Inside the house, the silence was too much. Even Daisy, his dog, seemed restless, pacing near the front door, pawing at it, as if she sensed that something wasn't right outside. Walt grabbed his keys and headed down the steps, moving like his joints were rusted metal, every motion deliberate, every breath an effort. He drove slowly, his Gran Torino humming low as it coasted down the familiar streets. Kids on bikes scattered as he passed, some of them flashing hand signs or shouting nonsense. He ignored them. He was looking for one face. One kid who had promise, who had looked him in the eye and asked how to be a man. But that kid wasn't anywhere to be seen. He found him at the back of the alley, behind Spider's cousin's place, leaning against a rusted chain-link fence, his arms crossed, a look on his face that didn't belong to him. Not yet, not fully, but it was getting there. Walt parked and walked over slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Thao didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just waited, like he knew what was coming. "So this is it," Walt said, voice dry. "You picked this over everything else." Thao didn't respond at first. Then he shrugged, a lazy, tired motion that stung more than words. "What else is there?" he asked. It wasn't anger, it was resignation. Walt stared at him for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "You had a choice." Thao smiled, but it was bitter, like a man who had already lost. "You don't know what it's like." Walt spat to the side, the phlegm dark, with blood. He coughed once, hard, and felt the old familiar pain in his lungs. "Don't I?" he said, voice low. "Don't you think I've seen more than you'll ever want to?" But Thao looked away. He didn't believe him. He didn't want to, because believing meant accepting that there was a way out and that he had walked past it. Walt turned and walked away without another word. He didn't look back. He had nothing left to offer a boy who didn't want saving. Days passed. Then weeks. Thao didn't come round. The gutter never got fixed. Walt drank more and talked to the ghosts of the past, his wife, his sons, who barely called, the friends who never made it out of Korea. He talked to Daisy, who listened better than most people. He talked to the Torino, polishing it with old rags, hands trembling with every stroke. And across the street, the house where Thao lived got quieter. Sue stopped saying hello when she passed by. Her eyes were always red, her words clipped. Walt could see the worry eating her alive. She didn't know where her brother was half the time. Sometimes he didn't come home for days. Sometimes he came back bruised or bleeding, smelling of beer and smoke and violence. Walt kept telling himself it wasn't his business anymore, that he'd tried, that you can't save someone who doesn't want saving. But every time he looked out the window, he thought of the boy who once struggled to lift a bag of cement without spilling it all over the driveway. He thought of the kid who had once asked him what it meant to be a man. Then one night, gunshots ripped through the neighborhood like thunder. Walt didn't flinch. He just sat there in the dark, cigarette burning low, the sound of sirens arriving too late, as always. He already knew whose name the officers would mention in the morning. But it wasn't Thao. Not that night. It was Sue. Wrong place. Wrong time. Or maybe not. Maybe she was the target. Maybe it was all part of some sick game that Spider and his crew were playing now, flexing their power in the face of a neighborhood too afraid to stand up. Walt went to the hospital, standing awkwardly in the hallway outside the ICU. He didn't go in. He didn't have the right, but he watched through the window as the machines beeped and blinked and kept her tethered to the world. Her mother sat beside her, praying in a whisper, rosary beads clicking between her fingers. And Thao, he was nowhere. Walt drove home that night with his heart like lead in his chest. The Torino barely made it up the driveway. He sat behind the wheel long after the engine had gone silent, staring at the empty house across the street. The next day, he saw Thao, face busted up, lip, split, blood on his shirt. He was laughing with Spider, standing on the corner like he belonged there, like he had always belonged there. And Walt, for the first time in his life, felt the full weight of failure. Not just his, but the world's. A world that swallowed boys like Thao whole and spit them out, angry and lost. He didn't go over. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his fists or voice. He turned away and shut the door behind him. He didn't speak to Thao again. Weeks passed, then months. Walt got sicker. The cough was deeper now, rattling like loose screws in a tin can. He didn't tell anyone. What was the point? He wasn't afraid of death. He'd already met it once and walked away. This time, he would walk into it on his own terms. He wrote a letter to his lawyer. He left the house in order. He gave Daisy to the neighbor's kid. He stood in the garage one last time, looking at the Gran Torino in the soft light of dusk. He ran a hand along its hood, the metal cool beneath his fingers. A car like that deserved a better world. He didn't leave it to Thao. He left it to the community center. Told them to raffle it off and use the money to fix the broken basketball court. Maybe buy some books for the library. Something that might actually help someone who wanted to be helped. He died in his sleep. Quiet and alone, as he always expected. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, a couple of vets from the American Legion. No family, no tears, but Sue came. She walked with a limp now, a reminder of the bullet that shattered her hip. She stood by the grave and said nothing, just looked at the name on the stone and remembered the grumpy old man who once growled at her brother and then taught him how to build a toolbox. And Thao, he didn't come. He didn't even know. Because by then he was gone, too, not dead, but gone in every way that mattered. Arrested in a sting a few months later. Armed robbery. Attempted assault. The look on his mugshot was empty. Eyes hollow like someone had reached in and scooped the soul out. He never mentioned Walt. But in a shoebox under his bunk, he kept a single folded photograph. An old man standing beside a green car. One hand on the hood, the other holding a beer. Both of them smiling. Once, long ago, and sometimes, late at night. Thao would stare at it and feel something twist in his gut. A name. A memory. A question he no longer dared ask himself. Outside, the world kept turning. The neighborhood kept changing. New faces moved in. New kids rode bikes past the same houses. The basketball court got repaved. A small plaque was nailed to the fence. In memory of Walt Kowalski, a quiet man who did what he could. And somewhere, in the rusted corners of forgotten streets, the echoes of a choice still lingered. A boy who could have walked one path and instead ran down another. A man who could have saved him and didn't. Because, sometimes, trying isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to walk away. And sometimes, the ghosts you leave behind follow you into silence. The prison where Thao ended up was 2 hours north of Detroit, surrounded by flat, snow-covered fields in the winter and dry, yellowing weeds in the summer. It was the kind of place where time hung like dust in the air and everything smelled like concrete and antiseptic. Thao had been there for nearly 2 years when the letter came. Not from anyone he expected. It wasn't from his mother, who had stopped visiting after the first few months. Or from Sue, who had moved downstate to work and start over. It wasn't from any of the old crew, most of whom were either locked up, dead, or pretending they'd never known him. No, the letter was from Father Yanovich, the same young priest who used to badger Walt Kowalski every Sunday until the old man finally gave up and went to confession. The envelope was thin, the handwriting neat, measured, unremarkable. Thao almost threw it away, but curiosity had a way of surviving where everything else had rotted. Inside was a short message, nothing dramatic, just a few lines. He wrote that he had spoken at Walt's funeral, that it had been a quiet affair, that the Gran Torino had helped pay for a new wing on the youth center, and that some of the local kids now played basketball, where once there had been nothing but cracked asphalt. He wrote that Walt had once cared a great deal about Thao, that he had believed in him, and that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him to try again. Thao stared at the letter for a long time. He read it once, then again, and then folded It carefully and slid it between the pages of the worn paperback he kept by his bunk. He didn't answer it. He didn't believe in letters. He believed in scars and fists and memories that clung like grease to your skin. But something in those words stuck with him like a splinter he couldn't reach. He didn't change overnight. He still got into fights, still kept to himself. But he started listening more. In the library, he asked for books. In the workshop, he asked to build things. The guards noticed. So did the chaplain. They stopped seeing just another gangbanger from the Hmong side of Highland Park and started seeing a young man trying to figure out if he still had a soul. By the time he was released, 5 years had passed. He was 25, older than Walt had been when he shipped off to Korea. He stepped out into the world with a cardboard box, and no one waiting for him. The streets outside the prison felt too wide, too quiet. The air felt wrong. He got on a bus to Detroit with a voucher in his pocket and a list of halfway houses in his hand. The city had changed. Gentrification had swept through like a slow-moving flood, pushing out families and painting over graffiti with bright, smug murals. His old house was still there, but someone else lived in it now. A young couple with a golden retriever and a Prius. The flower bed his mother used to tend was gone. The porch was painted blue. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. The halfway house was in the Cass corridor, a place that had once been synonymous with heroin and broken dreams, but was now trying desperately to be respectable. The room was small and smelled like bleach. His roommate was a twitchy white kid with tattoos on his face and a Bible under his pillow. Thao kept to himself. He found work through a temp agency, hauling bricks and driving forklifts, getting up before dawn and collapsing into bed at night with sore muscles and silence. Sometimes when he rode the bus home, he'd see boys who reminded him of himself. Kids with hard eyes and louder mouths, flashing signs and pretending they weren't scared. He didn't say anything to them. He didn't see himself as a savior. That dream had died years ago. But he watched them, and sometimes, when they caught his eye, they looked away first. One evening, after a long shift at a construction site downtown, he found himself walking past the youth center that had once been just an idea in a lawyer's letter. It was a squat brick building with a wide parking lot and a pair of outdoor courts gleaming under floodlights. Inside, laughter and the squeak of sneakers echoed. He stood at the fence, fingers curling around the metal like he had as a child, back when the world felt impossible but still open. He didn't go in. Not that night. But a week later, he came back. And this time he pushed open the door and asked if they needed volunteers. They did. There were always too many kids and not enough adults who gave a damn. He started slow, cleaning up, fixing broken benches, tightening bolts on the hoops. Then he started helping with homework, teaching shop skills, showing a kid how to hold a wrench the right way. And soon, they were asking him questions. About life, about choices, about gangs. He didn't lie to them. He told them everything. Not in one big confession, but piece by piece, like old paint flaking off. He told them about Spider and the gun and the night Sue almost died. He told them about prison, about how small the world becomes when you let anger define you, about the old man who once taught him how to build a birdhouse and expected more from him than anyone else ever had. And he told them the truth, that he hadn't listened, that he'd failed, but that didn't mean they had to. One day, after a particularly rough session with a boy who had just lost his brother to gang violence, Thao stayed late, sweeping the court. The janitor, an old black man with a limp and a kind face, came over and pointed to the plaque on the fence. "You knew him?" he asked. Thao nodded. "He was a tough old bastard," the janitor said, chuckling. "Came by here once, back when this place was still a wreck. Said we ought to blow it all up and start over." "Sounds like him," Thao replied, smiling faintly. "You were the kid with the car, huh?" Thao's smile faded. "I was the kid who didn't get it," he said. The janitor nodded slowly, then clapped him on the shoulder. "Looks like maybe you do now." Thao didn't answer. But he stayed an hour later that night, sanding down splinters from the bleachers so the younger kids wouldn't get cut. He never asked for forgiveness. He didn't think he deserved it, but he lived differently. He lived like every breath was a second chance, like every step was a way to repay a debt. Years passed. He got a real job. He bought a beat-up pickup truck and fixed it himself. He took classes at night. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He still had scars, both visible and not. But he carried them the way a soldier carries his medals heavy, but not in vain. And one day, when the youth center asked if he'd speak at a fundraising dinner, he stood in front of a crowd of strangers in a borrowed suit, and told them about Walt Kowalski, about a man who growled more than he smiled, who drank too much and said too little. A man who saw something in a scared kid and tried to pull him out of the fire. I didn't listen, Thao said, voice steady. I chose wrong. And because of that, people got hurt. I carry that with me every day. But what Walt gave me didn't die when I failed him. It just waited. Waited for me to be ready. There was silence when he finished. Then applause. But he didn't stay for the compliments. He went outside, sat in his truck, and looked up at the sky. Somewhere, he imagined, Walt was there. Maybe judging him. Maybe not. Maybe just watching. And for the first time in a long time, Thao didn't feel like running from who he'd been. He didn't think redemption was a light switch you flipped. It was a road. Long, uneven, full of cracks. But he was walking it now, one step at a time. He never got the Gran Torino, but he saw it once, at a local car show, perfectly restored, surrounded by admirers. He didn't tell anyone he knew the man who used to drive it. He just stood back and smiled, because that car wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the future, and he was learning how to be part of it. The seasons kept turning like pages in a book no one had time to read. Summer burned itself out. Autumn wrapped the city in dry winds and rust-colored leaves. And winter returned, blanketing the sidewalks and alleyways in silence. Thao learned to measure time differently now, not in months or birthdays, but in the number of kids who showed up to the youth center each evening. In the faces that stayed, and the ones that stopped coming without explanation. He got used to the cycle of how some would flirt with trouble and come back broken but wiser. And others would disappear entirely, swallowed by the streets like seeds planted in poisoned soil. He kept his head down, lived simply, ate alone most nights, worked until his body ached, then sat quietly with a book or old jazz playing on the radio. He rarely spoke of the past. Not to his coworkers, not even to Sue when she called on the holidays. She had built a life now, working as a nurse in Saginaw, dating a man with kind eyes and a little girl who called her Miss Sue before warming up to Mama. She still loved her brother, but they didn't have much to say anymore. Some distances couldn't be crossed just by good intentions. Thao didn't mind. He liked silence. It let him think, let him remember. And he remembered Walt often. In the way the cold made his joints hurt like they had for the old man. In the scent of motor oil that clung to his hands after helping a kid fix a busted bicycle chain. In the sharpness of his own temper, which he kept under tighter control now, knowing too well where it could lead. There were moments when Walt's voice echoed in his memory. Short, gruff commands, dressed in cynicism, but threaded with care. Hold the damn wrench like you mean it. Don't flinch. Pay attention. There was love in that, twisted and buried beneath layers of war and pain. But it had been real. It had been rare. One day, while cleaning out a corner of the youth center's old storage room, he found a stack of donated books and magazines, yellowed at the edges, abandoned long ago. At the bottom, half buried under a faded box of chess pieces, was a tattered manila envelope. Inside were a few black and white photographs, some handwritten letters, and a certificate of honor from the American Legion. They were Walt's things, likely donated by whoever had packed up his house after he died. Thao sat on the floor and went through them slowly. There was a photograph of Walt in uniform, younger than Thao had ever seen him, his face less lined, but just as stern. Another showed Walt and his wife, standing outside a cabin with snow piled high on the porch, her eyes squinting with laughter, his hand resting stiffly on her back. The letters were from other vets, dated over decades, some with shaky handwriting and faded stamps. A few spoke of guilt, some of brotherhood, others of wounds that never healed. There was one letter near the bottom, folded several times, addressed not to Walt but to the boy across the street. It had never been mailed. It was unsigned, just a few lines, short and rough. If you're reading this, I guess I didn't figure out how to say it in person. You're not like them. You're better. You don't have to be who they say you are. If you walk away, it'll hurt, but you'll make it. I did. Sort of. Do better than me. Thao held the paper for a long time, the words blurring behind the heat. In his eyes, it felt like a goodbye he hadn't known he needed. He took the photos, had them scanned, and added them to the hallway wall in the center's new veterans exhibit. He didn't put a name on the image of Walt. Just let the face speak for itself. That winter, a new boy named Lynn started showing up. 11 years old, all elbows and nervous eyes. Always standing near the exit like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. Thao took notice. Watched how he flinched when doors closed too loud, how he never took off his hoodie, even when it was 90 degrees inside. One night when the other kids had gone home, Thao sat with him and asked if he wanted to help sand down some benches. The boy nodded. They didn't talk much. But the next day, Lin was back. Over time, the boy opened up. His dad was gone. His mum worked nights. His older brother had gotten caught up with some older kids. Bad ones. The kind who drove tinted cars. And always seemed to be watching. Lin was scared, angry, alone. Thao saw himself in the boy so clearly it hurt. He started walking Lin home when he could. Talked to his mother, who looked 10 years older than she was, exhaustion etched into her every word. She thanked him with food and smiles, and stories of how things used to be back home, back in Laos, where the rain came harder and louder, but felt cleaner somehow. One night, Thao saw the brother, leaning against a car, hoodie up, same dead eyes Thao had worn once. The boy looked at him, recognized him. Maybe not by name, but by the way Thao carried himself. The posture of someone who had survived something they didn't talk about. He nodded once. Thao nodded back. That was enough. A line was drawn, and for now, the boy stayed safe. Still, it wore on him. Every time another kid vanished, every time a mother called crying, or a siren cut through the night, the weight of it gathered in his chest like a stone. Some days he couldn't sleep. Other days he slept too long. One morning, he woke up on the floor of his small apartment, the air thick and his chest tight. His lungs had been scarred years ago from something he'd never treated properly. Now the doctor told him the damage was permanent. Not fatal. Not yet. But enough to remind him that time was short and mercy had limits. He made peace with that. He spent more time writing, leaving behind pages for no one in particular. Thoughts, memories, advice he wished someone had given him sooner. He didn't call Sue. Didn't want her worrying. But he sent a birthday card to a stepdaughter. A small drawing of a rabbit holding a balloon. No signature, just a note. Stay kind. Then one afternoon, something happened that forced the past into the present, like a window suddenly shattered. A boy named Lane, one of the center regulars, 15, bright-eyed and full of jokes, was found unconscious in an alley. Beaten, robbed, gun in his backpack. Not his. Thao visited him in the hospital, sat beside his bed, watched the machines blink, and breathed for him. The mother was inconsolable. The police were circling. The story was already forming in the media. Another gang kid, another statistic. But Thao knew Jalen wasn't in that life. Not yet. He had been pulled, tricked, baited. So Thao went looking. He visited old places, knocked on doors that hadn't seen him in years. He walked into bars and basements, where the air was still thick with smoke and bad memories. Some recognized him. Most did in single quotes. He found out who did it. It was a kid named Curtis. 17, just a punk, trying to make a name. Thought beating someone like Jalen would earn him stripes. Thao found him at a gas station late one night, talking loud with his crew. He didn't threaten him, didn't raise his voice. He just walked up and said, "Quiet boys like you don't get remembered unless they hurt people." Curtis stared at him, confused, then angry, then nervous. Thao stepped closer. "But you don't have to be remembered that way." Curtis scoffed, turned away, barked something to his friends. But he didn't look back at Thao. Not once. A week later, Jalen came home from the hospital. Curtis disappeared from the neighborhood. No one asked why. Thao never spoke of it, just kept showing up to work. Kept sweeping the courts. Kept listening. Years passed. He never married. Never moved far. But the youth center changed. Grew new lights. New wings. A scholarship fund started in his name, though he never asked for it. And when he died quietly, alone, in his sleep, like Walt had, there were hundreds at the funeral. Kids grown into adults. Mothers with toddlers. City council members. Veterans, teachers. Even Sue, with her husband and daughter, now nearly grown. They buried him near Walt. Not beside him, but close enough. On his stone, they didn't write his failures. Just one line. He built something better. And that, finally, was enough. The years moved on, slow and merciless, leaving their fingerprints on every brick. Every person, every whisper that echoed through Highland Park's changing streets. The youth center Thao helped build became more than a safe place. Cliff became the center of the neighborhood's heartbeat. A place where the past wasn't erased but rewritten, where broken beginnings were not destinies but seeds. Its walls were painted and repainted by the children who grew up inside it. Each mural became a new story, some bright and full of hope, some jagged and raw with truth. The gym echoed, with the rhythm of bouncing basketballs and sneakers squeaking across polished wood. But deeper than that, it carried the sound of healing, of laughter returning to places that had forgotten how to laugh. There was one mural in particular stretching from the eastern wall to the edge of the front doors. It began with a boy in shadow, hands in his pockets, standing at the edge of a crumbling street. Ahead of him rose two paths, one lit by a quiet sunrise, the other vanishing into darkness. Between the roads, a man stood with his back to the viewer, hunched slightly, a cigarette in hand, a dog beside him, and an old car, green, proud, waiting. At the top of the mural were painted the words, "You always have a choice." The mural had no signature, but those who knew never needed one. The center expanded, grants came, donations followed. A small recording studio was added, then a garden, then a workshop with lathes and saws and rows of tools that looked like they belonged in Walt Kowalski's garage. Every edition bore Thao's imprint. Even long after his death, his lessons became rules spoken aloud by new generations of volunteers. Look them in the eye. Teach them the why. Let them fail, but not too far. Speak more with your hands than your voice. And most importantly, ever walk away unless you have to. Every year on the day of his death, they lit candles in the main hall and told stories. Not just about Thao, but about the kids he'd helped, the lives he'd touched, and the one life he hadn't been able to save his own, at least not all the way. Because while he'd been something like a hero, he'd never said it. He never asked to be forgiven. He only worked, one nail, one sentence, one broken boy at a time. There was a young woman named Mariah, who took over the center 10 years after Thao passed. She had grown up there, one of the early ones. The child of a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father she never met. She remembered Thao's quiet steadiness, the way he'd taught her to drill into drywall without cracking it, how he once handed her a library card and told her it was worth more than any necklace. She remembered his silences, too, how he would stare at old photographs as if time had stopped, as if he could still see the people he had lost moving between the frames. Under Mariah, the center began archiving its history. Photos, letters, interviews with the kids who had grown up there and made something of themselves. They compiled everything they could find on Thao, on Walt, on the neighborhood. She managed to track down Sue, now in her 60s, grayer and slower, but still quick to laugh and sharper than most. Sue donated a collection of her brother's notebooks, journals he had kept quietly for decades, filled with sketches, memories, lessons. The last pages were brittle. The handwriting trembled, but the words were clear. I used to think I had wasted my chance. But maybe life is made of borrowed chances. Maybe we get one and ruin it. Then someone else gives us another. Turned the journals into a book. Called it Borrowed Chances. It was raw, unedited, unflinching. Teachers began using it in classrooms. Those words once mumbled in basement workshops or scribbled on napkins now sat on the desks of children, trying to understand what it meant to come from broken places and still find meaning. And then came the next generation. One of the kids, a boy named Daniel, who used to sit cross-legged during reading hours with peanut butter on his cheeks, grew up to become a teacher himself. He taught history at the local high school and volunteered evenings at the center, where he showed kids how to record podcasts, how to ask questions that mattered, how to tell their story like it meant something. He never met Thao. Not really, he was only 8 when the man passed, but he wore a tiny engraved wrench around his neck every day. A gift from his mother, who'd once been taught to hold one properly by the same hands that had once built hope out of ruined wood. Daniels started a project with his students, a digital oral history of Highland Park. He sent them into barbershops, laundromats, corners of memory where the real city lived, and asked people what they remembered. One woman recalled Walt, the grumpy old man who used to yell at kids, and then, one day, changed. Another spoke of the car, the Gran Torino, that had become legend. A third remembered a time before the gangs, before everything fell apart. They wove these voices into a website, then a documentary. It won awards. It changed nothing and everything. On the 20th anniversary of Walt's death, Mariah organized an event, not a funeral, not a memorial, a homecoming. They set up tents, stages, tables filled with food. Old faces returned. Sue came, wheelchair-bound now, but glowing with pride. So did Father Yanovich, balder and slower, but smiling as he looked at what had grown from 2 stubborn men who once couldn't stand each other. Walt and Thao's names were spoken not as saints, but as men flawed, hard, real, who changed the course of something simply by choosing to care. a small theater group of neighborhood kids performed a reenactment, not of the movie, which most of them hadn't seen, but of the real events. A boy standing at the edge of a garage, nervous, an old man with a wrench, a girl bandaging someone's bruised hand, the sound of a car engine, the slam of a prison gate, and then, slowly, the sound of hammering one nail, then another, then another. The stage lights dimmed as dozens of young voices whispered, "You always have a choice." And behind them, projected on the wall, was a black and white image of Walt and Thao, standing in front of that car, neither smiling fully, but both present. Solid, real. The applause was quiet, reverent. After the event, Sue asked Mariah if the old house was still there. It was now used as a sober living space for teens who had been in and out of juvie. The porch had been rebuilt, the flower bed replanted, the inside smelled of lemon and paint. Walt's garage had been kept mostly intact, turned into a learning space. His tools were preserved in shadow boxes. His workbench stood untouched, as if waiting for him to return. Sue stepped into the room and wept, not loudly, but deeply, as if the years had cracked and everything she'd held in had finally spilled. Daniel sat with her afterward, and she told him stories, not just of Thao or Walt, but of her mother, the war, the neighbors, the sound of fireworks that weren't fireworks. And as she spoke, Daniel typed, preserving every word. Long after the event ended, after the tents were packed and the candles blown out, the work continued. A new generation began taking the reins. Kids who'd never known violence the way their parents had, who'd never needed to be pulled from alleys or police cruisers, who'd only known the neighborhood as a place of music, food, and someone always there to catch them if they stumbled. But still, on certain nights, the city remembered. The sirens still cried. The newspapers still buried the names of the lost. Sometimes, a familiar face disappeared, and no one had an answer. Grief never left. It simply aged. But every time someone gave up on a kid, someone else remembered Thao, and then they tried again. In the end, neither Walt nor Thao became legends. In the Hollywood sense, they weren't turned into statues or saints. But they became something else. A chain in a longer link. A story told over dinner. A tool passed from one hand to another. And in a dusty corner of the center, on a shelf of fading trophies and half-finished art projects, sat a small wooden toolbox painted red and green, worn smooth from decades of handling. Inside it, carefully folded, was a note in Walt's blocky handwriting. "You don't have to be anything but decent. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing in the world." It was enough, and the world for some became a little better because of it. The passing of time did not slow as the years wore on it, only gained weight. It accumulated like the dust in Walt Kowalski's garage had once done, quiet and invisible until someone stopped long enough to see it. Highland Park, once worn and neglected, had found its footing through decades of tireless work. Not because anyone had handed it hope, but because people like Thao had planted it. In the decades since his death, the neighborhood had risen through its own scars. There were still battles to fight, there always were. Now, the people fighting them carried tools instead of weapons, books instead of broken promises. And yet, the world around them kept spinning, unpredictable and indifferent. The youth center that had started as a single concrete block was now a small campus. They renamed it officially, the Kowalski Law Center for Community Development. The decision came not from a boardroom, but from a vote held among the teens who attended daily. Many of them had never known either man except through the stories, passed down by volunteers, teachers, and their own parents. But they spoke of Walt and Thao like archetypes, not as myth, but as truths. They could reach out and touch. One boy, 16, stood up at the naming vote and said, "My mom says they both messed up bad before they did something good. That's how I know they were real." That was the tone now. Not worship, not legend, truth. A hard, honest legacy. People still debated the decisions Walt made, the violence he once carried, the bitterness in his bones. They debated whether Thao had ever fully forgiven himself. But those debates never diminished what had been done after. They enhanced it. Because the redemption meant something only because of how far both men had come. By the 40th anniversary of Walt's death, the city had changed beyond recognition. The factory he once worked in had long since been demolished. The lot now held a public park with trees that rose like green monuments to an industry buried in rust. Where his house had stood was now the heart of the Recovery Campus, a central hub built from a fusion of old-world materials and modern design. Brick, steel, oak, Inside were classrooms, meeting rooms, a small health clinic, and a quiet chapel. At the center of the building was the original garage, preserved exactly as it had been, the old pegboard still dotted with outlines of missing tools. The stool where Thao once sat still tucked under the workbench. The smell of oil and sawdust lingered like memory, refusing to fade. School children came by on field trips. Some were given little assignments to sketch a tool, to write a journal entry from the point of view of a kid who once built something with his bare hands. One girl wrote, "I think the old man must have been really mean but also really sad, and maybe that's what made him try so hard to fix the boy." Her teacher saved the paper and mailed it to Sue, now in her 80s, living in a retirement home outside Ann Arbor. Sue read it aloud during a small community reading circle. She had outlived nearly everyone who knew the story firsthand. Her children had grown, and her grandchildren were in college or traveling, full of the life she had always wanted for them. But in those quiet, book-lined afternoons, with people who still wanted to remember, she spoke of her brother with a voice that didn't tremble anymore. She spoke of how angry she had been when he joined the gang, how helpless she felt, how she hated Walt for giving up. But then she'd pause, reflect, and smile. But I didn't see then how the story kept going. We only see the tragedy at the time. Later, if we're lucky, we see what bloomed from it. Her audience listened, they took notes. One woman, an author, later wrote a memoir about growing up as a second-generation immigrant in Detroit, using the center as a metaphor for survival. She called it Tools and Ghosts. In it, she said, "We are all haunted by who we almost became. But in the right hands, even ghosts can build." The center's leadership passed through many more hands. Young people who had once sat silently at the back of those workshops now became the directors, counselors, builders of the next steps. One of them, a young woman named Ayanna, spearheaded a project to expand the center's reach into Flint and Southside Chicago. She believed that the model, one rooted in legacy, accountability, and real community investment, could travel, and it did. It wasn't flawless. There were setbacks, resistance, bureaucracy, but it kept going. And everywhere it went, the story went with it. In the new buildings, replicas of the original mural were painted on interior walls, now updated by local artists, showing a new generation of faces walking alongside the same old ones. In one version, Walt is depicted not with a cigarette, but with a hammer, raised as if passing it forward. In another, Thao stands beneath a stormy sky, holding the toolbox with both hands as light pours through a break in the clouds. And always, those same words linger at the top. You always have a choice. People began to visit Highland Park, just to see where it began. Urban historians included the center in walking tours. Documentaries were made, some good, some hollow, but all feeding into a larger awareness. The story was no longer just about two men. It had become about the neighborhood, about what people could do when they stopped waiting to be saved and started saving each other. Yet, among all that growth, there were those who remembered the moments between the monuments, the quiet things, the silence of Walt sitting with a can of beer on his porch while Daisy lay at his feet, the creak of the garage door opening each morning, the sound of Thao sweeping sawdust from the floor, even after he didn't need to, a single pair of work gloves hanging from a nail, the memory of Sue's laughter echoing from the kitchen. Somewhere, the quietest part of the center's archives, sealed in a weatherproof box, are two items kept together by choice, not ceremony. One is a dog tag, worn smooth by years of being held, with Walt Kowalski's name etched in fading steel. The other is a folded piece of paper, written in Thao's careful hand. It reads, "You tried to save me and I turned away, but I still heard you. Every day after, I heard you. You told me I could be more, and I was too scared to believe it. You told me to walk away from the fire, but I stayed. You didn't pull me out. I hated you for that. But later, when I had to learn how to walk without anyone pulling, I understood. I wasn't ready then, but I was listening. I never stopped. I carried you in every nail, every kid I tried to reach. You didn't save me. You taught me how to save someone else, and that's why I'm still here." Below the letter is a hand-drawn symbol, two lines crossing to form a crude wrench. It has no label. It doesn't need one. In the decades that followed, many things changed. Technology surged. Cities swelled. The problems facing the world shifted in shape, but not in weight. But the Kowalski Law Center remained. Because, while the world moved forward, people still needed places to return to. Places built not on miracle or charity, but on the slow, steady redemption of those who once nearly broke. And in that neighborhood, Where once a man stood alone on a porch, where a boy once turned his back on a better life, where mistakes echoed louder than victories, there now stands a forest of stories, of rebuilt lives, of choices made differently, again and again and again. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear the hammer, still feel the sawdust, still see the ghost of a Gran Torino rolling quietly into the dusk, leaving behind not a roar, but the gentle hum of something solid, something earned, something finally right. By the time the sun finally began to cast a softer light on Highland Park, decades after Walt Kowalski had taken his last breath and Thao had quietly stepped into the night, the city had become a patchwork of faded hopes and cautious rebirths. The neighborhoods that once echoed with gunshots and angry shouts now buzzed with tentative laughter. The clatter of sneakers on concrete courts, the warm murmur of community meetings held in classrooms painted bright with murals and promises. It was a city that carried its wounds openly, but one that refused to be defined by them. The Kowalski Lore Center, rising like a quiet monument at the heart of the old neighborhood, was more than just a building. It was a living archive of resilience, a testament to the power of choices made under impossible circumstances. Children came and went, their names folding into the long list of those who had sat beneath those walls and learned to wield their own tools, both literal and metaphorical. They learned to build, to fix, to listen, to dream. One spring morning, as the dogwood trees blossomed with delicate white petals, a young woman named Lena arrived at the center carrying a worn leather satchel stuffed with notebooks and photographs. She was the granddaughter of one of the original kids who had come to Thao as a scared boy decades earlier. Her eyes were bright with curiosity and determination, a mirror of the generations who had inherited the stories, but now sought to write their own. Lena had grown up hearing whispers of the two men who had shaped the destiny of her family and countless others. Walt, the gruff old veteran with a heart buried beneath layers of pain, and Thao, the boy who had walked a different path, who had faltered but finally found his way. She was a historian by training, but a storyteller at heart, and she believed that the truth of their lives held lessons the world desperately needed to hear. She settled into the archives, poring over the journals and letters, the faded photographs and scratched recordings. Each piece revealed fragments of a complicated tapestry of violence and love, loss and hope, bitterness and grace. There were stories of fights and forgiveness, of mistakes made and chances given, sometimes lost and sometimes redeemed. One evening, as the center prepared for a commemorative event marking the 50th anniversary of Walt's passing, Lena discovered a bundle of unpublished letters hidden within an old wooden toolbox, the very same that had once belonged to Walt and Thao. The letters were written by Walt himself, a collection of confessions and reflections never meant for anyone else's eyes. They revealed the inner turmoil of a man haunted by his past, his regrets for the mistakes he could not undo, but also his quiet pride in the small ways he had tried to change a boy's fate. He wrote of his war wounds, not just on his body but etched into his soul, of the loneliness that gripped him after his wife died, and the unexpected kinship he found in someone he once barely tolerated. Lena knew that sharing these letters would be controversial. They painted a man who was far from a hero in the traditional sense, flawed, bitter, sometimes cruel, but they also revealed his humanity, his capacity for growth, and the legacy he had left behind. She prepared a lecture and a documentary, piecing together the voices of those who had known Walt and Thao, interwoven with the unvarnished words from the letters. At the commemorative event, the center was packed. Former kids, now adults, with their own children, teachers, community leaders, and those who had only heard the stories from afar, all gathered to listen. Lena spoke with a quiet authority, reading Walt's words aloud, allowing the audience to hear the pain and hope in his voice. The room was silent for long moments after she finished. Then came the applause, not loud or raucous, but deep and heartfelt. A collective acknowledgement of a legacy born from the ashes of broken lives. In the years that followed, the center expanded its mission. It became a hub for restorative justice programs, mental health counseling, and vocational training. It partnered with local schools and law enforcement agencies, building bridges where suspicion had once festered. Programs were developed to support families affected by incarceration, addiction, and violence. The spirit of Walt's stubbornness, and thus redemption, infused every new initiative, a reminder that change was possible, but only if people dared to believe in each other. Lena remained at the center, her passion fueling the work. She mentored new generations of leaders, many of whom came from the very neighborhoods that had once seemed doomed to despair. She knew the stories of Walt and Thao were not endings, but beginnings, blueprints for resilience in a world that often felt indifferent. One afternoon, as a late spring sun filtered through the windows, Lena sat with a group of teenagers in the workshop, teaching them how to carefully restore a vintage motorcycle. Among them was a boy named Malik, whose father had once walked the path that Thao had almost taken. Malik was quiet but attentive, his hand steady as he learned to wield the tools. After class, he approached Lena with a question about the history of the center and the men who had inspired it. She told him the story, not the sanitized version, but the raw, complicated truth of anger and forgiveness, failure and hope. Malik listened closely, the weight of the past settling in his young eyes. He asked if it was really possible to change, to break the cycle. Lena smiled gently and said, "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but yes, you always have a choice." Years turned into decades, and the neighborhood continued to evolve. The youth center's influence spread to other cities, becoming a model for community-driven transformation. The legacy of Walt and Thao lived on, not just in bricks and mortar, but in the countless lives touched by their story. It became a testament to the power of flawed people doing their best to build something better. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of Highland Park, the echoes of a grizzled old man's wrench and a boy's uncertain steps still lingered, reminders that even in the darkest places, redemption could be forged, choice by choice, hand to hand, heart to heart. The seasons turned with relentless consistency, carrying decades of change on their backs, like tired travelers who never quite settled. The city beyond Highland Park morphed, and stretched buildings rose and fell. New faces replaced old, and technology pulsed through every corner of life, shifting the ways people connected and communicated. Yet, beneath the surface of glass and steel, the heartbeat of the neighborhood remained steady, a rhythmic reminder that some things endure through storms, neglect, and time. The Kowalski Law Center had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. What had begun as a simple space for a handful of troubled youth was now a sprawling campus, its influence stretching across state lines, inspiring similar efforts nationwide. The center's original walls, once cracked and graffiti-tagged, were now preserved as a living museum. The air inside carried the faint scent of sawdust and oil, reminders of tools wielded with purpose, hands calloused from labor and love. Among the countless stories born there, one had emerged as a guiding thread. The story of two men, Walt and Thao, not as heroes sculpted from flawless stone, but as flawed, broken souls who had found a way to build something better amid ruin. The center's archives overflowed with artifacts, old photographs, weathered journals, letters yellowed with age. Each item was a testament to struggle and survival, but also to transformation. It was here that Lena, now in her late 30s, continued her work as the center's chief historian and storyteller. Dedicating herself to preserving and sharing these narratives, her passion had ignited a movement of remembrance, one that embraced the complexity of humanity. Lena had spent months curating an exhibit titled Choices Forged, which chronicled the intertwined lives of Walt and Thao through photographs, personal writings, and oral histories. It was designed not to glorify but to provoke reflection on mistakes made, lessons learned, and the enduring power of choice. The opening night of the exhibit was a gathering of generations, elders who remembered the old neighborhood before change, adults who had once been the children saved by the center, and young people eager to understand the roots of their community's resilience. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation, a mingling of reverence and curiosity. As the lights dimmed, Lena stepped forward and shared an excerpt from Walt's unpublished letters, his words raw and unguarded. He spoke of loneliness, regret, and a hard-earned hope. The echoes of battles fought both abroad and within. The audience listened, some with tears glistening, others with thoughtful nods. It was a reminder that redemption is not a moment but a journey, often paved with pain. Among the attendees was Malik, now a young adult, whose steady hands had once repaired vintage motorcycles in the center's workshop. He had grown into a community leader himself, carrying forward the legacy with quiet determination. Malik had recently launched a mentorship program, aimed at young men grappling with the pressures that had once ensnared his father and his peers. He believed in the center's mission, not as a cure-all, but as a bequeener, place where broken paths could be redirected by patient hands. As the evening unfolded, stories were shared, some joyful, others heartbreaking. A former gang member who had found solace in carpentry, now a teacher. A mother who had lost a child to violence, but channeled her grief into advocacy. a young woman who credited the center for saving her from a life she never imagined. Outside the exhibit, the city pulsed with its usual energy. Traffic hummed along the main streets. Children's laughter spilled from playgrounds. Vendors set up stalls for a nearby market. Change had arrived, but the old struggles had not vanished. Instead, they had transformed, finding new faces and challenges in the shifting landscape. The center's impact extended beyond its walls. Partnerships with schools, law enforcement, and social services created a network of support that wove through the community. Programs focused on mental health, addiction recovery, job training, and restorative justice blossomed. Each success was a small victory against systemic wounds that ran deep. Yet, amid progress, the legacy of choice and consequence remained ever present. Lena often reminded those she mentored that the past was not a chain, but a mirror reflecting not only what had been, but what could be changed. This ethos resonated most profoundly in the stories of the youth who walked through the center's doors, many of whom carried burdens heavier than their years. One such story was that of Aiden, a boy who arrived with wary eyes and a clenched jaw. His family history was marred by incarceration and addiction, the kind of cycles that often seemed impossible to break. Through the mentorship program led by Malik and the restorative justice circles facilitated by Ayana, Aiden began to glimpse a different path. Slowly, he learned to trust, to express pain without violence, to see himself beyond his circumstances. Aiden's transformation was neither swift nor linear. There were setbacks, arguments, moments of defiance, nights spent wandering streets, too familiar with danger. But each challenge was met with unwavering support, rooted in the belief that no one was beyond redemption. Years later, Aiden stood before a crowd, much like the one Lena had once addressed, sharing his story with raw honesty. He spoke not as a survivor, but as a testament to the enduring power of community, choice, and relentless hope. His voice carried the weight of the past, but the promise of the future. Beyond individual stories, the center became a hub for dialogue on race, class, and systemic injustice. It hosted forums where law enforcement officers and residents could confront painful truths, seek understanding, and forge new relationships. These conversations were often difficult, marked by frustration and tears, but they laid the groundwork for healing that transcended bricks and mortar. The physical landscape of Highland Park reflected this evolution. New businesses opened, streets were cleaned and repaired, parks revitalized. Yet, amidst progress, the shadows of history lingered in the cracked sidewalks, the vacant lots, the lingering mistrust. The work was ongoing, a delicate balance between honoring the past and shaping the future. In quiet moments, Lena reflected on the intertwined lives of Walt and Thao. Their story was a paradox of resistance and surrender, bitterness and grace, violence and compassion. It was a story not of heroes and villains, but of flawed humans wrestling with their demons, and, ultimately, choosing to build rather than destroy. She often thought of Walt's old garage, preserved like a time capsule within the center. The worn workbench, the pegboard dotted with tool outlines, the faded green Gran Torino in a photograph taped to the wall, reminders of a man who had fought his own battles and, in his final act, tried to save a boy he barely understood. And that boy who had once turned away from a better life, but had found his own way through quiet resilience, hard work, and the painful lessons of loss. His legacy was etched, not in monuments, but in lives changed. Hands steadied, futures reclaimed. As night fell over Highland Park, the city lights twinkled like stars fall into earth, illuminating streets where countless stories continued to unfold. Within the walls of the Kowalski Law Center, voices rose in laughter, in debate, in song, echoes of a community bound by shared struggle and hope. The legacy of Walt and Thao endured, not as a tale of redemption neatly tied with a bow, but as a living, breathing testament to the messy, beautiful complexity of human choice, the possibility that even in the darkest places, light can be forged, one decision at a time.